Hello, this is the Harvard Government Department's program on constitutional government. I'm Harvey Mansfield, and our speaker today is Matthew Continetti. Matthew Continetti is a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He was the editor and founder of the Washington Free Beacon. He was also an editor on the late lamented Weekly Standard. And he's an editor at National Review, and he writes for many, mostly, I have to say, conservative publications. And you can see him on TV, on Fox News. He got his bachelor's degree in history from Columbia. And his books are one of The Persecution of Sarah Palin, 2009, The K Street Gang, 2006, and now one that's coming out next Tuesday called The Right, The 100 Years War for American Conservatism. It's a big book. It's nearly 500 pages long. And so here's Matthew Continetti to talk about his book.
Thank you, Harvey. It's a pleasure to be here. Hopefully my internet connection will hold, and so this will come on through clearly. I'm reminded today, as I so often am, by my mentor, Fred Barnes, as a toast for his mentor, the journalist Robert Novak. Fred once said, "Bob, your words will be remembered long after Shakespeare's are forgotten, but not until then." Fred was a great source of one-liners. He once told an intern struggling over an article, "This ain't Balzac." And 8 years or so ago, when I complained to Fred that my infant son was keeping me and my wife up at night, Fred said, "Don't worry, Matt, it only gets harder." But during one editorial meeting, a colleague complained that an article our magazine was about to publish wasn't that good. "You're forgetting one good thing about the piece," Fred said. "It has the quality of doneness." And so after many years of work, I'm happy to say that my history of the past century of American conservatism, the right, shares in the quality of doneness. It'll be published on April 19th, and I hope you were able to read it and enjoy it and tell me what you think about it. The book grew out of my 2 decades of experience working as a journalist with Fred Barnes and many other conservative writers in Washington, D.C. And today I want to introduce you to some of the main themes of the book and how the past explains where the right finds itself today. On July 7th, 2003, 3 months into the Second Iraq War, I showed up at 1150 17th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. I had just turned 22 years old. It was my first day as an editorial assistant at the Weekly Standard. The address will be familiar to many of you. At the time, 1150 17th Street was the frontal cortex of the American right. On the same floor as the Standard was the Project for a New American Century, a small think tank that devoted itself to reports on the state of American defenses and open letters urging regime change in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And the top floors, of course, housed AEI, where I work today. That morning, I was walking into not just a building, but an intellectual and political movement. In 2004, when 2 editors of The Economist magazine wrote a book called The Right Nation, Conservative Power in America, I felt a thrill of recognition when the authors identified 1150 17th Street as a center of a rive droit, a right bank of intellectual activity in the nation's capital that included the nearby Ethics and Public Policy Center, the offices of the Public Interest magazine a block away, and the DC offices of the Hoover Institution, then up Connecticut Avenue. The rive droit is gone now. The building at 1150 17th Street was demolished in 2016. In fact, a friend reminded me recently that a fire broke out within its empty shell on that election night, a physical manifestation of the election's impact on the conservatism of the time. PNAC and the Standard no longer exist. 2003 is a distant memory. The intellectual community housed within 1150 17th Street dispersed. I have spent the last decade wondering why. How, I asked, had Mitt Romney lost the 2012 election, only to see Donald Trump win it 4 years later? Was the Trump coalition, I wondered, the echo of Richard Nixon's silent majority? Reagan Democrats, and Newt Gingrich's Republican Revolution? Or was the Trump election something different, something new? What explained the gulf, I wondered, between my colleagues in Washington and self-identified conservatives beyond the Beltway? Why had matters long thought settled, the benefits of trade, the blessings of immigration, the necessities of war, become contested? Why, come to think of it, was there a conservative movement to begin with? As I read old books, magazines, journals, and letters, I found that 20th century conservatism had been motivated by a sense of impending crisis, a feeling that the free societies of the West were endangered. The surface cause of this crisis, conservatives believed, was the growth of the state and the expansion of territory under communist dominion. But the loss of physical ground was a consequence of spiritual impoverishment, a lack of confidence, an unwillingness to take stands, to roll back threats. What had caused this enfeeblement? No one knew, or rather no one could agree on its origin. Traditionalists said one thing, libertarians said another. This difference brought me to my first conclusion about American conservatism. It is not monolithic. It is many different squabbling, disagreeable conservatisms fighting for supremacy. Try to define American conservatism. There is no single answer. But the adjective modifying the noun provides a clue. American conservatism is exactly that. American as opposed to, say, European. Conservatives defend. When the term was born in the late 18th century, during the French Revolution and its aftermath, European conservatives defended the established institutions of monarchy, state church, aristocratic privilege, national language, and culture. What about the Americans? We have no king, no official religion, no titled classes. The national language, it takes care of itself. Indeed, it's becoming the world language. Our national culture is multifaceted. It's wild and eccentric and occasionally violent, as our population is. What do Americans conserve? Here is my answer. American conservatives defend the founding idea of liberty and the familial, communal, religious, and political institutions that sustain it. American conservatism must refer to our origin, the founding, if it is to have any anchor and enjoy any success. My answer is not the only option, however. American conservatism is a contested tradition. The traditionalists I mentioned argued that order, justice, and religious virtue were of equal value and perhaps superior to political and economic freedom. The libertarians took the opposite stand. For them, freedom was the primary value. Religion and communal life, what Milton Friedman called the ethical problem, was best left to the individual. Cold warriors argued that the preeminent concern of the 20th century was the rise of communism, and that meant a permanent defense establishment and intervention overseas to defeat the Red Menace. Agrarians despised capitalism as destructive of Southern folkways. Political philosophers on the West Coast said that conservatism was worthless unless it was based on the idea that all men are created equal. The fusionists thought that freedom and virtue worked in tandem and that the true virtue was uncoerced. Radical Catholics said that fusionists were wrong, that the primary end of political life is virtue, and that Americanism is a false ideology. Neoconservatives looked at all of these other groups skeptically and were ready to maintain the New Deal and many programs of the Great Society. Paleoconservatives blamed neoconservatives for polluting the right with statism, immigration, free trade, and foreign intervention. I'm barely scratching the surface. None of the different camps within American conservatism were ever as powerful as the others believed. And the picture becomes more complicated still when you consider that the divisions are not only based in ideas, they are structural. The Republican Party, for example, is not naturally conservative. It's a political party. It reflects the values and principles of its members. True, its leaders have a record of supporting constitutionalism and economic freedom. Many conservatives call the Republican Party home. But in its efforts to win 50% plus one of the vote, the GOP has often strayed from conservatism. That is why the foremost goal of the American conservative movement in the second half of the 20th century was to capture the Republican Party and convert it into a vehicle for conservative public policy. But that movement, the conservative movement, is not the same as the GOP. The conservative movement has always had a separate existence and a tempestuous relationship with the Republican Party. The movement is comprised of institutions and activists. They are the single issue people, the movement people, advocates of gun rights, the right to life, the right to work, of property rights, taxpayer rights, of school choice, religious freedom, family values. DC is filled with their offices. They exist to pressure the Republican Party, to hold it to account. They are often disappointed. Their hopes are often unfulfilled. Like activists of all stripes, they have trouble taking yes for an answer. The movement is greater than the intellectuals. Now, the intellectuals, books, magazines, newsletters, television appearances, and tweets give them prominence, while in fact, the intellectuals are the smallest part of this conservative coalition I described. You could fit them all into a Zoom call, and it wouldn't be much larger than the one we are on now. Politicians pay less attention to the intellectuals than to the interest groups, to the movement. Party prerogatives matter even more. It's often tempting to take the intellectuals at their word, to assume what they are saying reflects the biases of the movement and the agenda of the GOP. Don't make that mistake. And finally, there is a broader category of thinker who may dissent from the conservative movement, who may dissent from mainstream conservative intellectuals, who may criticize the American founding and American society, but nonetheless oppose the broader progressive left. And these figures belong to what I call the right. Each element of this coalition needs to be understood on its own terms. None of it works together easily. For over a century, the intellectuals, activists, and politicians have been arguing about the relationship between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the place of minority rights in a majoritarian democracy, the tension between a populist desire for liberty and an elite commitment to institutions, and the choice between isolationist protection and international involvement. Get two conservatives together, and you will have at least 3 points of view. This fractiousness contributes to the movement's dynamism. It contributes to the movement's adaptability and continued relevance. But the diversity of opinion within conservatism is often ignored. Outside observers, liberal historians mainly, tend to downplay the differences on the right. They pathologize all of conservatism as the expression of status anxiety, of bigotry, of phobia. They're not only wrong, they blind themselves to the realities of American politics and to the weaknesses of their own position. But conservatives should not make the same mistake. Of course, we do. Conservatives often commit the fallacy of composition, taking the part for the whole. That wouldn't happen if they devoted more attention to the study of their own past. Conservatism is not monolithic, and history is not linear. As a sociologist Daniel Bell used to joke, the greatest historian in the world is Dr. Heinz Seid. When we look at the past, we need to recognize the influence of personal agency, of individual human will, and we need to recognize the role of chance. What appears to us as a logical chain of events was contingent. Conservatives like to say that ideas have consequences. That is true, but accidents have consequences too. We don't like to admit it. Conservatives and liberals tell themselves stories about the American right. Conservatives say that their movement began in the wilderness. Then William F. Buckley Jr., the founder of National Review, came along, and he led the American right to political relevance by winning the 1964 Republican nomination for Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Goldwater lost that year, of course, and by a considerable margin, but the ashes of his candidacy, according to this conservative story, were fertile soil for Ronald Reagan, who brought conservatives to power in 1980. Since the heights of Reagan's presidency, conservatives say, the movement has endured setbacks and divisions. Conservatism still shapes American democracy through the set of intellectual institutions and media platforms that gives it a voice in public debate and an influence in politics that was unimaginable when the movement began. Conservatives admit that Donald Trump's descent on the escalator in Trump Tower in June 2015 caused friction within the movement, but they also believe he recalibrated conservatism along populist and nationalist lines and attracted new constituencies to its cause. The liberal version of the story I told is not that different. It also begins slightly after World War II. It also begins with conservatives in exile. But the left tends to ascribe the rise of the right not to the failures of liberal governance, but to a racist backlash against civil rights that has grown only worse with time. While the story that conservatives tell highlights institutions and politicians, left-wingers play up grassroots organizations, big league financial donors, and psychological motivation. For the left, the story of American conservatism is a story of American populist reaction. It is a long-running berserk refusal to submit to the ministrations of liberal rule. For the left, Trump is not a deviation from American conservatism. He is its endpoint. Both stories contain elements of truth, but neither captures the American right in its full complexity. The conservative narrative is too neat. The edges of the movement have been smoothed over. Its blemishes have been covered up or ignored. But the left's narrative overcorrects for the right's mistakes. The left ends up pathologizing conservatism. It reduces a vast and complex movement to nothing more than the ongoing expression of base prejudice. This diagnosis might explain the behavior of some of the men and women who have associated with the conservative movement and voted for Republican candidates, but it does not explain the whole. Both the conservative and liberal stories are too pat. They give the impression that it was inevitable that conservatism would arrive at this moment. But it was not inevitable. Nothing is inevitable, at least nothing in the realm of human affairs. Part of the problem is that both the conservative and liberal stories are warped by what I call the Reagan distortion field. They revolve around the 40th president. They can't see past him. They take him as the central character in this history, where he should be treated as one figure among many. Both conservatives and liberals treat Ronald Reagan as the benchmark of conservatism, the measure of what conservatism was and what it should be. For conservatives, Reagan is the protagonist in a hero's journey that begins with the Screen Actors Guild and ends with him riding off into the California sunset. For liberals, Reagan is either a befuddled clown or a charming adversary. He either accidentally or slyly manipulated white America into enacting a pro-corporate agenda of tax cuts, reductions in welfare spending, and hostility to labor. Certainly, Ronald Reagan's historical importance cannot be denied, and I will not deny it. But neither can Ronald Reagan's uniqueness. Reagan's charisma and clarity were an exception in the history of the American right. His unique political talent led almost every faction within the right to think that he was on its side. To this day, every American conservative wants to claim Ronald Reagan. Last December, the Pew Foundation asked Republicans which president had done the best job in the past 40 years. Reagan still comes in first place, but Donald Trump is close behind. The truth about Reagan is messier. Ronald Reagan's presidency was not the preordained outcome of the post-war conservative movement. Reagan always was just one alternative among many. His triumph in 1980 was unplanned. His victory in 1984 was the result of his courage in staying the course with highly controversial and often unpopular policies. Conservatives griped about Reagan throughout his years in office. He didn't acquire mythic status until years after he left the White House. When you focus on Reagan, you are tricked into thinking that ideas can be seamlessly translated into action and that conservative elites share the same priorities as the conservative grassroots. This is a mistake. Reagan shows what is possible, as he often said he wanted to do. But he is an exception. It is rare for elites and the public to agree. Elites and the public are more often in tension. Does American conservatism represent insiders or outsiders? Are conservatives the elites, the men and women in charge of America's political, economic, social, and cultural institutions? Or is American conservatives people? That is the question that faces every generation of conservatives. And it is a question that has never been satisfactorily answered for long. The story of American conservatism is the dynamic between elite-driven ideological propagation and populist mobilization against liberal extremism. Conservatives have toggled between the two strategies as they have built institutions and professional networks and tried to meet normal people where they are and to respond to their ambitions passions, and enmities. No tricks are involved. Any successful political movement must incorporate both elites and the people. Only intermittently, however, have conservatives been able to synthesize these two elements. That is why conservatism's victories have been so tenuous and why its coalition has been so fragile. Let me give you an example of an elite-driven strategy. Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist, published The Road to Serfdom in England in 1944. It came out in America the following year. Dedicated to the socialists of all parties, Hayek warned that abandoning economic freedom for central economic planning set nations on the primrose path to totalitarianism. Yet books, even The Road to Serfdom, were not enough for Hayek. He wanted to build an institution devoted to the promotion of economic freedom and individualism. He wanted to establish a global network of classical liberals. Its first meeting was held in Montpellier in Switzerland. The conference opened on April 1st, 1947. On April 10, the attendees agreed to a statement of aims. The document left no doubt that these beleaguered liberals felt themselves engaged on the losing side in a battle of ideas that had been raging for more than a century. Over large stretches of the Earth's surface, the essential conditions of human dignity and freedom have already disappeared, the statement began. The position of the individual and the voluntary group are progressively undermined by extensions of arbitrary power. At this point, however, the group still hadn't settled on a name. The debate grew so intense among the economists and social thinkers assembled that one suggested they just refer to themselves by the location of the meeting. No one had a better solution, and so the Montpellier Society was born. Hayek articulated his overall strategy in a 1949 essay entitled The Intellectuals and Socialism. Ideas drive history, Hayek believed, and thus intellectuals, what he called professional secondhand dealers in ideas, were far more important than most people assumed. In every country that has moved towards socialism, Hayek wrote, the phase of the development in which socialism becomes a determining influence on politics has been preceded for many years by a period during which socialist ideals governed the thinking of the more active intellectuals. It was ironic, Hayek said, that parties of the left so often interpreted public affairs as a clash of economic interests, despite the overwhelming influence that men of ideas exercise over the climate of opinion. To revive classical liberalism, Hayek went on, it was necessary to inspire these secondhand dealers of ideas. Hayek's approach, then, was directed at the people running things. A change in the ideological perception, and then in political reality, would come about only after enough intellectuals became convinced of the classical liberal ideal. The libertarians associated with Hayek turned to education, writing great works and popular pamphlets, issuing new editions of great classical liberal texts, teaching at universities and in privately funded seminars to pull the rising generation of elites toward their viewpoint. Elite-driven strategies begin with the work of intellectuals, whose ideas shift the climate of opinion in society by permeating institutions and gradually shaping the minds of young people. Consider the life of Irving Kristol, the journalist and social philosopher who went from supporting Leon Trotsky in 1942 to endorsing Richard Nixon in 1972. Long before he joined the American Enterprise Institute, Kristol became convinced that social science was being put to bad use and that policymakers required correction. He and his friend Daniel Bell launched a quarterly journal, The Public Interest, in 1965, where good, accessible social science would disprove the erroneous conventional wisdom of their fellow liberal intellectuals. The Public Interest never enjoyed a high circulation. Kristol joked that he never wanted the magazine to have more than 700 subscribers, so long as they were the right subscribers. Nor was Kristol interested in money. Many years later, when the internet was taking off, a young sub-editor at the Public Interest suggested to Kristol that the magazine create a website. Kristol grudgingly agreed. "Do whatever you want," he said, somewhat ironically, "but I can't stand the thought of all those vulgar people reading my magazine." The Public Interest aimed at nothing less than creating an alternate faculty of social science. Its contributors applied the law of unintended consequences to the study of social programs. In issue after issue, they evaluated government not on its intentions, but on its results. And they found, more often than not, the results unsatisfying. Over the course of its 40-year lifespan, the public interest disproved for its elite audience the shibboleth that government programs are always and everywhere the best ways to reduce inequality and promote social health and happiness. These elite-driven strategies were based on conservative mastery of what a former vice president of the Heritage Foundation once called the decision-making loop. Formulate concepts, communicate them to policymakers, and watch as theory is turned into practice. But here conservatives faced a dilemma. Since 1932, they rarely found themselves in positions of power. Gaining access to the levers of policy required another force. It required populism. What is populism? Like with conservatism, there is no easy answer. The late Jeffrey Bell once defined populism as confidence in the decision-making power of everyday people, while elitism is confidence in the decision-making power of experts. Popular revolt takes place when long-standing policies no longer live up to their promise, when elites or experts won't acknowledge or respond to changing circumstances, when these same elites interfere in private decision-making, especially decision-making within the home and within the family. Populism is a feature of American democracy. The United States has a long experience with it, and populism is often a catalyst for change. It expresses neglected concerns. It frames politics as a debate between elites and the people, and whoever is on the side of the people, well, they tend to win. But populism also has serious drawbacks. It can descend into the rule of the mob. Demagoguery is its handmaiden. Populists often look for scapegoats, and they can succumb to conspiracy theories. Without proper direction, populism can turn radical, rebellious, antinomian, law-breaking. Populism has no guiding principle other than the people, yes. And without principle, things can get ugly. Populism has left and right varieties, and they meet at the extremes. But populism, that is the rejection of expert rule, also fueled some of conservatism's greatest victories from the 1960s to today. As Irving Kristol once put it, there is nothing like the utopian idiocies of the extreme left, the infantile left, as Lenin called it, to stir thoughts of moderation among the centrist majority. When experts screw things up or attempt to mess with children, populism rears its head, and conservatives have won as a result. For much of the 20th and 21st centuries, conservatism and populism worked in tandem. They were synchronized. They produced a conservative governing class in the presidencies of Reagan and the two Bushes. Beginning in George W. Bush's second term, however, elite-driven conservatism diverged from the populist grassroots. It wasn't only the liberal elites that populists began to challenge. They went after conservative elites too. The divide emerged with the debates over immigration in Bush's second administration. It was visible in the anti-war Ron Paul liberty movement in 2008. By the time of Barack Obama's presidency, the populists were in open revolt against the DC establishment. The Tea Party was the vehicle to remove pro-war, pro-immigration, pro-trade Republicans. And the 2012 election was a turning point. Mitt Romney represented the best the elite-driven strategy of conservatism had on offer. He lost, and President Obama's second term initiated a crisis in democratic legitimacy. The 2014 border crisis and Obama's subsequent expansion of his deferred action immigration program, despite his stated position that he lacked power to do so, and a midterm election that had gone horribly for him. These things convinced the populist grassroots that only a disruptor could rebalance the American political system. Civil unrest in the forms of the Black Lives Matter movement and chaos abroad with the rise of ISIS and the Islamic State caused many people to think that the situation was spiraling out of control. Years of slow growth, meanwhile, had dulled the American economy. The populists turned to the outsider, to Donald Trump, a man who they thought could run government like a business, secure the border, reorient the nation away from Obama. International trade was Trump's way of explaining the collapse of male labor force participation and the growth of deaths of despair from drug and alcohol abuse. Trump's strongest supporters within conservatism came from the network of institutions, spokesmen, and causes that had propelled the populist revivals of the late 1970s. He was anti-Republican establishment. The single-issue groups were behind him. He did well where former Alabama Governor George Wallace had done well in 1968. When Trump became president, he disestablished that decision-making loop, even as he adopted many of the policies that conservative elites had advocated for decades. What began in the 20th century as an elite-driven defense of the classical liberal principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution of the United States ended up in the first quarter of the 21st century as a furious rebellion against elites of all stripes. Many on the right embraced a cult of personality and illiberal tropes. The danger was that alienation from and antagonism toward American culture and society could turn into a generalized opposition toward the constitutional order itself. What are conservatives to do then? What is conservatism for? As the future unfolds, conservatives must return to the wisdom of their best minds and advocates. As William F. Buckley Jr. said in 1970, I see it as the continuing challenge of National Review, his publication, and thus of American conservatism that it spoke for, to argue the advantages to everyone of the rediscovery of America, the amiability of its people, the flexibility of its institutions, of the great latitude that is still left here for the individual, for the delights of spontaneity, and above all, he went on, the need for superordinating the private vision over the public vision. This rediscovery of America, in my view, must center on America's founding documents, for there would be no American conservatism without the American founding. The Constitution and its amendments ground conservatives eager to preserve and extend the blessings of liberty that are the right of every American. The Constitution grounds conservatives in a uniquely American tradition of political thought that balances individual rights and popular sovereignty through the separation of powers and federalism. The Constitution not only protects human freedom, but also creates the space for the deeper satisfactions of family, religion, community, and voluntary association. A free society, said Hayek, needs permanent means of restricting the powers of government, no matter what the particular objective of the moment may be. And the Constitution, which the new American nation was to give itself, Hayek went on, was definitely meant not merely as a regulation of the derivation of power, but as a constitution of liberty, a constitution that would protect the individual against all arbitrary coercion. One cannot be an American patriot, in my view, without reverence for the nation's enabling documents. One cannot be an American conservative without regard for the American tradition of liberty those documents inaugurated. As someone on this call once said, America cannot abandon the great principles of classical liberalism, above all the principle of self-government, and with it, the constitutional means for achieving and preserving it. And that was Harvey Mansfield. The long and winding road on which the various bands of conservatives have traveled over the last century has brought them to a fair amount of political power, but also now to an even greater amount of cultural despair and internal disarray. Conservatives are confused, uncertain, anxious, and inward-looking, even as they eagerly await the populist repudiation of the Democrats that it seems to be sure to come this fall. The building that I entered so many years ago at 1150 17th Street is gone, but the story does not end there. Can conservatives harmonize their principles with the sentiments of the current populist revolt? Can they reformulate a conservative governing class for the second quarter of the 21st century? I am confident they can. And I'm confident because when you study conservatism's past, you become convinced that it has a future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt. That was really a fine talk. We have some questions.
Well, we are opening it for questions now. Otherwise,
I have
you
a
can
question
start,
if you
but
want to,
yes.
if you want to start. One of the features of the right versus the left seems to me to be that the right believes that the left will always be there, whereas the left doesn't really believe in the permanent existence or necessity of the right. And the left tend to be, they're progressives, and progress means progress in solving problems and disposing of them rather than continuing them and having to keep fighting on one side. So what do you think of that difference, or do you, or maybe I'm wrong to suggest it?
Well, I think that you're right. And I think that the left is always hoping that conservatives will go away. And this leads the left to pathologize conservatism, as I suggested at the beginning of my talk, to not take the concerns or criticisms of conservatives seriously, because they're distractions or impediments to this future that the left wants to bring about. I spend a lot of time in my book talking about the dangers of extremism on both the left and the right. And it seems to me as a student of history that what really helped the right attain power in the late 1960s, carrying on through the 80s and 90s of the 20th century, was the left's unseriousness and its capture by radicals, and the public view that extremism in the form of domestic terrorism or attacks on America, spelled with a K, meant that the left was no longer a credible political alternative. And so the public turned to the right. And I think it's a danger for the right too, though, that it go too far, that it becomes seen as not a serious alternative, maybe even an anti-American one in the eyes of the public. And so I worry about the internal disagreements of the left and the right as much as I think about the ongoing struggle between left and right.
Isn't there sort of a continuing problem, though, for conservatism that there will always be liberals?
Right.
The good fight is never over. Maybe that's generally true of politics, but it does seem that conservatives like liberals, but maybe not to the same extent, are wishing that politics would come to an end. Is that the characteristic of extremism, that it wants to do away with the issue
Yeah.
rather than merely solve it or take a position on it?
I think it depends. There's this liberal idea, progressive idea, that there are solutions to our problems, and that we can settle them permanently, depoliticize them, even remove them from contention. And that tendency, I think, can drive populism when certain decisions are being made outside of the arena of democratic control and debate. Radicalism to me is the attempt to overturn, to strip out from the roots and create something new. I'm not quite sure I'd describe that as problem solving, but you see it in my history when I talk about the events of the 1960s and the birth of the New Left. And one of my favorite quotes from Irving Kristol is when he was reading one of the a testimony of one of these New Left radical activists, and the activist said, it was quoted in the New York Times as saying, "You don't know what hell is like unless you've grown up in Scarsdale, New York." And Irving was always amused by this, is saying, well, hold it, the whole point is to get you this comfortable life in Scarsdale, New York. He was amused by it, but he also saw in it something deeper, which was that liberalism, mid-century liberalism, was not satisfying young people's yearnings for a whole and meaningful life. And that emptiness was driving them to want to repudiate the entirety of the system. And so this is what I think conservatives ought to guard against, is attempts to overturn the constitutional order. And I worry now that some of those attempts may be coming from the right as well as the left.
Thank you. Jeff Bristol, please.
Yeah, so maybe this is a good follow-on to that last comment. You know, one of the things that I find remarkable about the kind of new right, or the newest right, or I guess however you want to refer to them, you know, thinking about some of the integralist projects, common good constitutionalism, common good originalism, whatever you want to call it, is that there's this narrative there that talks about we were all together under Reagan with fusionism, and now we're all apart. And I kind of find that interesting. Were we ever really all together under fusionism? Is that really kind of a thing that's true? And then accompanying that question, you have some of these people I think are aligned with that, but not exactly in this kind of common good movement. I think like Warren Cass and American Compass, where they're exploiting this divide between the intellectual elite on the right and the common people by kind of saying that they are on the side of the common people, although it often strikes me that they really are kind of just are not. They are kind of refashioning a lot of these intellectual narratives and kind of throwing up occasionally like a working class essay to kind of support that. So, you know, what are these bundles going on? So, I mean, kind of are they legitimate? How do they fit within the history of American conservatism? Is it all the same? Is it new? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, one of the lessons of researching and writing this book is that Ecclesiastes was right. There is nothing new under the sun. The debates that we're having now over fusionism, over the ability of economic and social conservatives to work together, have been going on since this theory of conservatism was first coined and described in the mid-1960s. And if you go into the archives of the old conservative magazines, you see endless debates. Not only, by the way, social conservatives attacking this idea that libertarians and traditionalists can work together, but many libertarians, especially during the Vietnam era, attacking the same idea. Because for the libertarians, the idea that the right's anti-communism would lead it to embrace a large standing army and intervene militarily overseas was anathema as well. So it's one of the things I try to fight against in my book, is this idea that there was some perfect history, you know, this golden age of conservatism that has been lost or corrupted. Well, there was no golden age. It was always argumentative. It was always fractious, and there is an evolution to it. This is also one reason why I begin the book in the 1920s, because I wanted to show that the conservative movement that gave rise to Reagan and that was so influential, well, it wasn't the only alternative on the right. That prior to the Second World War, there was a right in America, but it looked unlike the right that Reagan represented. On the second question is a very complex one, which is the relation of elites to populist movements. And it is often funny and often pointed out by liberal commentators that the leaders of this new right, the leaders of this populist movement are graduates from Harvard Law School or Stanford or Yale, or as the former president was also an Ivy League alumni, right? The Wharton School, the best school ever, as he might say. But this has always been a problem for the right as it attempts to harness a populist revolt whenever it surges. And it's represented too in the life of William F. Buckley Jr., which I discuss in my book. Buckley was somewhat surprised that when he ran for mayor of New York City in 1965, he did best in the outer boroughs. He did best with traditionally Democratic voters, the same who fit the profile of the Trump voter so many years later. The ethnic voters from the south and east of Europe, who had descendants of immigrants from there, who tended not to have college degrees. And Buckley had to figure out where he stood in relation to populism. On the one hand, there were elements of it that he agreed with. On the other, though, he saw some negative alternatives, especially in the person of George Wallace, who he fought tooth and nail during the late 1960s and early 1970s. So this anti-elite elitist is a recurring character in the history of the American right.
Yeah, I think it's funny if I could just share a quick anecdote that kind of highlights this. There was, I'm in Tampa, Florida. There was Josh Hammer came maybe about a year ago now to give a common good constitutionalism talk to the local Federalist Society. So these are people with graduate degrees. You know, he was going on about how, you know, we in Tampa can understand him so much better than the elites in the Beltway. And he was giving his typical spiel about Aristotle. And of course, you know, he only knows the final cause. But, you know, and then going on and talking about legal positivism. And one of the attorneys in the audience came up and asked a question, said, you know, I just don't really understand. What is this legal positivity that you're talking about? You know, so I think you might hit the nail on the head with that one.
Avi, please.
A couple of things. You didn't mention anything about the media or the role of the large media in terms of sort of presenting these varying philosophies to the populace as a whole, and their ability to portray and characterize leaders of the party. You know, the media in general is oriented against conservatism. They certainly disparaged Ronald Reagan, have certainly, and also done so with Trump. So I'd be curious to know how you factor the role of large media into the analysis. The second thing is, where to from here? If we're going to advance conservatism, I realize it has different stripes. It's got to have a political manifestation, probably in the Republican Party, and that leads to concern of the influence that Trump still has with the Republican Party and all that portends. So I'm curious as to what your prescription would be in terms of trying to advance the worthiness of the objectives as opposed to the forces from the left that are pulling us in the other direction.
Mm-hmm. Great. First on the media, yes, I don't, this talk doesn't really make reference to it, but the book it has extensive narrative about the relationship of the right to the media, a relationship that really became hostile in the 1964 presidential election, where the supporters of Barry Goldwater were just aghast at the treatment he received, really libelous treatment in some cases from the media. And so taking off from there, the conservative critique of the liberal media only grew with time. And so, of course, Nixon deputizes his vice president, Spiro Agnew, to give a series of speeches beginning in 1969, attacking the media as a clique based in New York that's determining what everybody thinks and reads. And this persists. In 1982 in DC, the Media Research Center is founded, which is devoted to pointing out how liberal the media is. And at the same time, interestingly, a counter institution is created, the Washington Times, the conservative alternative to the Washington Post. So conservatives have always battled against this liberal media, and have been quite successful in my view. I know that there are many debates now about the conservative representation on online social platforms. But I think, judging from 1920, say, or from 1964, conservatives have been very successful in building an alternate media structure. But I'd add, though, that Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon and George H.W. Bush won their landslide elections in environments where that alternate media landscape did not exist. And so somehow they were able to break through the liberal media monopoly. And even with the existence of a conservative counter media today, Republicans have not enjoyed the huge landslides that some of their predecessors have. On where to from here, I think the model we should keep in mind is a coalition, just as the right has always been a coalition. And so conservatives of my stripe, constitutionalists or institutionalists, are going to have to find a way to maintain a position within this coalition, recognizing that there are other elements within it. And secondly, doing the best that we can in order to provide alternatives to the liberal policies that are driving the electorate crazy and driving the electorate into an oppositional attitude toward President Biden. So it would be one thing if the Republicans have a wonderful election in November and then show up for work next January on Capitol Hill and have no idea what to do. I have an idea of what would happen. In fact, I know what will happen. They'll try to impeach Biden if they have no alternative policies. So if my job, or not my job, the job of my colleagues here at AI is to come up with the alternatives that might successfully address the problems at the root of so much of our discontent. And the third thing I'd suggest is the policing factor, the police power that William F. Buckley Jr. was able to exercise, basically fencing in what American conservatism was and keeping out elements that he thought would damage it in the eyes of the mainstream, the conspiracy theorists, the racists, the anti-Semites. It's much harder to do that in today's America because of the nature of our institutions. But I do think it's incumbent on conservatives to police their own institutions. You can't police everybody because everybody has access to a megaphone. But if you are in charge of an institution, I think you need to have some sense of the standards that William F. Buckley had and enforce them.
Is there a danger that Trump will end up being portrayed as the face of conservatism, not just the face of populism? I mean, in a way that's being attempted now by the media and by people on the left. But I fear that it could become that he is considered to be the symbol, the emblem of conservatism, with, I think, all sorts of damaging consequences to the movement, both at the philosophical level and the political level.
Yes, I couldn't agree more with you. I think the real inflection point wasn't Trump's victory in the Republican primary in 2016. It was his election as president. And presidents, by the nature of the office, exercise huge influence, not only on the direction of the country, but on the character of their party, of the institution they lead. And I, at first, for much of Trump's presidency, was skeptical that he would change the nature of the party, simply because I thought his personality was so eccentric that it would be hard to translate. But I was wrong. By 2020, it was clear that he had created many Trumps, and they seem to be proliferating. So yes, this is a danger, but it also means that leadership matters, and that if Trump were to lose the nomination in 2024, a different type of leader, someone who might be able to maintain the coalition with some of the modifications Trump made to it, but with a different, say, facade, a different personality, could reshape conservatism in more beneficial ways.
Eric Dempsey and then Andy Zwick.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question. I have a particular interest in like Catholic and Catholic adjacent forms of conservatism. And I was wondering if you could just give me some, I mean, I should know more about this stuff, and I'm curious to hear the opinion of someone who's more immersed in this kind of thing than I am. Can you say a little bit about the emergence of the Integralists and how they fit, especially against the backdrop of some of the conservative Catholic thinkers from 20 years ago, right? Like the First Things crowd that, in my opinion, was more friendly to liberalism, at least classical liberalism generally, even if they weren't quite classical liberals. I mean, what do you sense has changed there? What do you think that the trajectory of that debate is? I just kind of want to hear what you think about that.
Mm-hmm. It's such a rich subject. Thank you for bringing it up. And I do discuss it at length in the book, The Right. I discuss integralism, but I spend a great amount of time on the Catholic neoconservative thinkers that you referenced, figures like Michael Novak, figures like Richard John Niehaus, who started as a Lutheran but entered the church later in his life around the time that he founded First Things magazine. They are some of, I think, the most interesting characters in my story, and they're not remembered. It's amazing to me. So the idea of integralism, that the state should reflect the church, maybe not in a theocratic way, or at least some integralists would deny that they're theocrats, but that the leadership of the state and state policy should be aligned toward the higher good that is represented in the Catholic Church. Why has it emerged over the last 6 years? I think a couple of reasons. One is that there is a sense among younger thinkers in particular that the trends in Catholic conservative intellectual thought had basically run dry, that Michael Novak's defense of capitalism from a Catholic standpoint did not hold in the aftermath of the Great Recession in the financial crisis of 2008. The Catholic lawyers who were important to the formulation of originalist jurisprudence seemed, in the eyes of a younger generation of conservatives, to have basically run aground, that the originalist project was running out of steam. It had made its key points, and it was going to take you some places, but it wasn't going to take you where you wanted to go as a believer, as a devotee of Catholic social thought. I think that integralism and this new right, which we've mentioned in a couple of questions, I should say as an aside, I've counted the new rights in my history. There are 3. So this isn't the first new right, and I don't think it will be the last one either. This new right is very much, I think, an online phenomenon. I think it has a lot to do with the rise of social technology, social media, and viral ideas. I also think it's a reaction, though it's not often stated this way. I think it's a reaction to the crisis within the Catholic Church, as represented by the child abuse scandals, and that it's a way to reconnect with an earlier tradition of Catholicism that isn't tainted by what happened during the abuse scandal. So I think there are a variety of things happening that make these ideas attractive to younger Catholics in particular. But I do not think, as of yet, I see much evidence of these ideas seeping into mainstream American politics. Even though many of these people on this new right end up as Trump supporters, I don't think if you described it to him, Trump would embrace integralism. I'm not sure that's really where he falls.
Andy, where are you? Are you still here?
I am. Matt, thanks so much for your talk, and I look forward to reading your book. And my sense is that you probably are addressing some of the things that I want to ask you about, but I would like to draw you out on them now. Starting from the ideas of the right, which is where much of your talk has taken us, and maybe 2 directions away from that. One is the topic of style, in other words, as opposed to substance, and how that's manifested itself in our politics and the Republican Party. And then on the other end, I know you've written about this in regard to the end of the Cold War, for example, the way in which events have affected the politics of the right and the Republican Party. So beginning with style, I wanted to ask you about, I guess in the most recent context, a debate among intellectuals and others about Donald Trump, whether the key feature that allowed him to win the Republican nomination in 2016 was about his being a celebrity versus the policy ideas that are associated with populism that you mentioned, for example, positions on immigration and trade and so forth, and maybe going back in the preceding decade or two, the ability, let's say, of George W. Bush to, in 2000, have both a set of policies that were associated with the establishment, quote unquote, but also to have the regional accent and a certain kind of swagger, as opposed to, for example, Mitt Romney in 2012, or the counterfactual of what it would have been like to have somebody like Chris Christie oppose Obama with, for example, similar policies as Romney, but with a very different style. And in fact, we saw Christie as part of the Donald Trump orbit in 2016 and in 2020. So that's the style and substance aspect. And then on the events aspect, suffice it to say, things have changed dramatically since February with Putin's war on Ukraine. And I'm curious to ask you about how that will affect the right in your judgment.
Sure. Well, if just to talk about presidential politics, or really any elective politics, candidate quality matters immensely. I think we see that with the Youngkin election last November. The candidate who was, attacked as a radical in a fleece by Joe Biden and Barack Obama had a demeanor that just deflected this portrayal, and so surely style matters. I would say, though, with Trump, at these rallies that were so anchored in his personality, the crowd was chanting "Build the wall." So there was an idea there behind their support, this idea that immigration was out of control, illegal immigration was out of control. You had to do something about it. So it worked in sync. And the Trump, why did he win the nomination? He benefited from having this committed base of support in a fractured multi-candidate field. In the big contest early on, Trump did not win a majority of the vote in any of them. He didn't win a majority of the votes overall in the Republican primary in 2016. But he did win the presidency. He was the most unpopular candidate in the history of Gallup polling of presidential races. But he was fortunate because he ran against the second most unpopular candidate in the history of the Gallup poll of presidential races. And he ran against Hillary Clinton at a time when the public was ready for change. The public was ready to move on from the Obama years, years in which Clinton was the Secretary of the State. Events in Ukraine, I think it's fascinating that many of Trump's Trump adjacent figures on this new right held an emergency meeting in Washington last week. And the emergency wasn't Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The emergency was that Russia's invasion of Ukraine might discredit their foreign policy. So they got together in DC to figure out what to do about this problem that Putin, who they had been kind of championing in many ways as the chief enemy of globalism, had, despite their predictions, gone through with this invasion. So what to do about it? I think it displayed a sense of panic in these quarters that their preferred foreign policy may not make much sense in a post-Ukraine world. And just to respond to the chat, yeah, I agree with that. He won that contest of unpopularity. However, I don't see a return in the Republican Party anytime soon to the type of crusading internationalism that characterized George W. Bush's presidency. And even when you ask Republicans about foreign policy questions, they are for helping the Ukrainians, for arming them, but they are very reluctant to become involved as combatants in this war in Ukraine. And so I recently had a piece in the Wall Street Journal talking about how this is a recurrence to an earlier right, a more non-interventionist right. And I'm not so sure that Ukraine is enough to kind of shake the right out of that position.
Thank you. Tom Palmer, can you unmute yourself?
Thank you. Matthew, I enjoy your comments all the time on Fox News, and I look forward to reading the chapter in your book on the media. I've worked in the media for 40 years, and of course, I'm more disgusted than ever with the media, as I was often when I worked in it for 40 years. I tried to do objective reporting, and I think there were many who were trying to change the world rather than doing objective reporting. But you said something about how the right in the media have developed some establishments that are sort of holding their own or keeping up with the liberal media. I mean, I couldn't disagree more with that. I worked in California and grew up in Kansas and keep in touch with people all over, and of course watch what's going on today. My sense is that the liberal media overwhelmingly inform the American public. I mean, those ones you referred to do talk to a small group, a relatively small group, both influencers and maybe some others, but by and large, what Rush used to call, I guess, the low information voters or the general public. I don't think it gets through. NPR is extremely liberal, and so many people listen to that all day, and they basically take what the New York Times puts on page one and call that news. I just think that liberal media, I think our debates would be hugely different and our policies would be different in this country if we had anything resembling an objective media, and it's overwhelmingly liberal, even though Fox obviously is very important, and talk radio is to some extent too. But I don't know. I wish you were right on that.
Yeah, you may well be right. I will note that the most widely shared material on Facebook is all conservative. And I think if you look at the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list this weekend, you won't see my book. It's not out yet, but you will see, I think, close to half a dozen conservative books, Bars, Mammoths, and then it goes down from there. So I think I agree that the major institutions are captured by this sensibility. But I do think that the conservatives have more of a voice in the conversation, certainly than they did at the beginning of my history, or even for much of it.
Yeah, just to add, I often think all my friends are liberal. I live in Boston, but I don't have any conservative friends really, except on this Zoom maybe. But the big problem seems to me that it isn't even different opinions. It's that we know completely separate sets of facts by the different media that we are listening to. And my son is very liberal and lives in New York. And when we have conversations, half the time he doesn't even know what I'm talking about if I'm talking about the laptop or something like that, because he hasn't heard about it. And that's a tough one if you don't have any media that are commonly consumed.
As one of my heroes, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, used to like to say, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. Well, now it does seem as though everyone feels entitled to their own facts, right?
He was talking about facts that were wrong, I think. And here we're all talking about facts that are right, but we just are talking about
Right.
principles that don't overlap.
Overlap, yeah.
Thank you.
Matt, I have a question on where to go from here on future policy. You said there's nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes is right, but I don't know, I haven't lived here that long in this country, but it seems like overall the situation of the family, you know, the falling apart of the family, this kind of thing, the situation of education, the type of people that go into education, that want to educate, there have been tremendous shifts. And to breaking up families and to, it seems like there's an extreme leftward shift in education that used to be different. People who became teachers in the, I don't know, 50s, 60s, I don't know. It seems, what are the conservative or what are the Republican ideas to actually address this? Because it seems that those are things that, I don't know, you can't really address. And those would be foundational for having a healthier country.
Well, I just mentioned Moynihan. His infamous report on the Black family came out in 1965. And all the trends have gone in a negative direction since then for every group. So on the one hand, nothing's new under the sun. We've been worried about the family and this trend since 1965, but we have not figured out what to do about it. And in fact, now I think the debate has moved on to how to improve childbearing, how to increase the size of families and family formation. And even there, the direction is unclear. Lowering the cost of living would be a good start. So that might connect to some of the conservative critiques of the inflation that's happening. Making it easier to start a family might induce family formation and more children. But there's never been a good answer provided. On education here too, in some ways, Buckley makes his debut on the education issue with his book, God and Man at Yale in 1951, criticizing the academy, higher education. Now, though, we're arguing about K through 12. And while there were debates over textbooks and sex ed have been going on for 40, 50 years, there is a new trend in the debate about what attitude should pedagogy assume toward America itself. And this is making it a very polarizing and I think, potentially dangerous debate for those of us who are concerned about the health of our country and patriotic feeling. I think there, the response of the right has been to empower parents on one hand and to encourage school choice or alternate forms of schooling on the other. And I think so far, I'd be more encouraged by the education debate than say I would by the debate over families. Because it seems to me that for the first time in my lifetime, 40 years, Republicans are winning on education, which is not an issue that is traditionally associated with them. And they're winning precisely because they are emphasizing parental choice, involvement, and curricular transparency. So I think that's important, even as though the stakes of this fight have become even higher.
Thank you.
Another question that may take us back to Trump and the question of populism. It's always seemed to me that conservatism is a way of thinking that has a certain mannered aspect, that is refined. It's a refinement, whereas populism, and especially Trump, revels in vulgarity. And so, would you agree with that? And also, while we're at it, do you think Moynihan was a conservative?
Moynihan went through different phases, like all great thinkers. And there is a time when he was a neoconservative. He definitely was in the orbit of Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz and writing for the Public Interest and for Commentary magazine. And I in 1975, when he denounces the Zionism as racism resolution at the United Nations, National Review names Moynihan their Man of the Year. And then he, of course, ironically, he then defeats William F. Buckley's brother the next year to become the senator from New York. Today, Moynihan would be considered a conservative, a far rightist, but I don't think he considered himself one. On the first question on populism, populism populism fights constraint and mediation. It needs to fulfill the will of the people and doesn't want to be blocked in doing so. And so you're right, the job of conservatives is actually to say, well, we have to observe the restraints, or we have to observe the formalities before we achieve that rule. The process does matter as much as the actual result. And this takes me to Reagan, because as I say in my talk and in my book, Reagan can distort our view of populism, because I believe he was a populist in many respects, but he rather than reflecting the anger of the populace back on itself, he redirected it, and he infused it with his own very unusual personality that always was optimistic, forward-looking, future-oriented. And so he was able to provide a hope, whereas other populists are ready to just continue in the anger, right? So this is why this tension between populism and conservatism is why William F. Buckley was so hostile to George Wallace, and then ambivalent about the new right of the 1970s, which was populist. And it also gets to why so many of the editors of National Review were hostile to George Wallace, and why someone like George Will can say that populism and conservatism are antithetical to one another. But I do think that there's been a relationship between the two phenomena in American politics, and the success of the conservatives has always been when they benefit from the populist revolt, but have in place a set of ideas and policy actions that they can then use to address the causes of the populist revolt, right? And I think that's what happened in the 1980s and 1990s, but it hasn't happened yet in the beginning of the 21st century.
So it's important for conservatism to maintain a certain formality, and as you say, it's a way of deflecting, answering to anger, but deflecting it or returning a mode of courtesy.
Yeah,
wearing a tie
and a jacket. Yeah,
it's interesting that all the politicians in Washington still wear suits. Even Donald Trump is forced to wear a suit.
Yes,
it doesn't appeal to anyone who ever does. So conservatism sort of looks on that, I believe, with favor, and feels attracted to it and needing it. in a way that the other side does not.
Mhm.
Avi, do you want to ask another question?
Yeah, I don't think you talked about, I came across a group new to me anyway, called the NatComs. And these are short for National Conservatives, which a group I think is trying to elevate the concerns about nation, that somehow there should be a way traditional allegiance to the nation as a whole. I don't know if you have any thoughts about them, but the other thing that occurred to me is we have an inherent disadvantage. I wonder if it's fatal. And that is that the left always promulgates the idea of subjugating the individual to the collective. And therefore, one of the most important objectives is to be able to aggregate the individuals and move forward. And that, of course, gives them an essence of power. Whereas we on the right always subordinate the state or the collective to the individual. We make the individual supreme. Well, that makes it harder to organize large efforts, collections, individuals in order to accomplish the goals. And I don't know, is that a fatal flaw, as it were, in terms of the architecture of this, this national debate, when we will always be playing catch up because it's just harder for us to get to put enough of our resources together to counter a group that inherently has their resources collected from subordination of the individual.
Just on that last point, I think there's something built into our politics, that is, the right reacts to the left. The left makes the first move. You need to have liberalism to have conservatism. You need to have radicalism to have conservatism. And this is always the case. And this is why the moment in the 20th century is so interesting, the later 20th century, is because the right was able to turn this around. And, rather than just simply being anti-communist, they were pro-democracy. Rather than being simply for, balanced budgets, they were for pro-growth, right? They were able to have their own ideas that the right was that they were able to launch affirmatively and put the left on the defensive. And I'm not sure where we are in that dynamic today. It seems like the right is very much reacting to the left. Though in other places, it does seem that the right is advancing and the left is reacting. And I think of the controversy in Florida right now, where it's the right pushing a legislation about school curricula, and that's the left that's reacting and causing controversy. So you can see this dynamic work in both directions. And just briefly on the National Conservatives, this is another of the kind of post-Trump groups on the right, and they do put the idea of national identity at the center of their system. But I think that conservatism has always appealed to the nation as one of these groups in this great chain of being that we're a part of, from our families to our communities up through the nation. So I think my short answer would be that they're pouring old wine into new bottles. And they also, I think it's also interesting in light of what's happened in Russia, Ukraine, because the principle of nationalism, like populism, can work for both the left and the right. There can be positive aspects, there could be negative aspects to nationalism. So whose nationalism? Putin's or Zelensky? And so if the answer is Zelensky, right? But is that nationalism, or is it Zelensky's form of nationalism, which is liberal democratic nationalism, right? And so I think that matters just as much. And it's some of these national conservatives are waking up to that. And in fact, I think it's producing splits within their movement between figures who are sympathetic to Ukraine and other figures who continue to view Putin as the challenger of the progressive international order.
Well, Matt, this has been wonderful. Very fine talk. And you whetted my appetite for reading your book when it comes out.
Thank you, Harvey. It's a pleasure to be here.
It sounds as if it's full of truth.
Yes.
Thank
And it quotes you extensively, which means it's full of truth, right?
Oh, okay. You've taken me aback.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, everybody who came.
Good day.